Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Wee. I'm a librarian working in collection curation and engagement at the wonderful State Library Victoria. I just want to take this opportunity to welcome you to the library for the next instalment of Windows on Collections titled Comics and Immigration. It promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking evening with some of Australia's top minds and creatives working in this area. But before I begin, I want to do an acknowledgement of country. So on behalf of State Library Victoria, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of all the Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that our collections hold traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We also pay our respects to their elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. So before we commence proceedings, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the State Library collections, just to provide you with a bit more context as to why we continue to collect and preserve materials such as comics, graphic novels, and zines for the state of Victoria. In recent years, the publication of comics, graphic novels, and zines has undergone a significant boom. And coupled with the rise and rise of DIY self-publishing in both print and digital formats. I don't think it would be unfair to suggest that we are in the middle of a renaissance of the graphic literary format. And, perhaps when we look back in 50 years, we might recognize this as Australia's, second golden age of the medium. As the repository of print and published material for Victoria, the State Library has an interest in ensuring that the collection reflects the diverse communities as well as the disparate voices with which we serve. In terms of the collection, thanks to the foresight and advocacy of some librarians at State Library, such as Des Cowley and Dermot McCall, the library has been collecting this kind of material since the mid-1990s. And thanks to the work, we now hold the most comprehensive collection of zines in the country, a collection that also includes the working collection of author and academic Anna Paletti. As well as this, the State Library also holds significant collections of comics, of Australian age comics in particular, as well as important international titles, and they're through generous donations by Alyssa Campbell and Kevin Patrick. We also, coupled with the clear collection development policy, we're continuing to seek relevant acquisitions from booksellers and collectors. But for some of you might be asking why, does the State Library collect this material? For me personally, I think it'd be reasonable to suggest that we have put behind us that antiquated notion of the comic, graphic novel, and zine as being unsuitable or even unworthy of being held in cultural collections. In fact, when we look particularly in the past 2 decades, there's been significant scholarly inquiry into this area, including but not limited to areas such as sociology, anthropology, and in recent years, medicine as well. Research suggests that comics and graphic novels improve therapeutic and literacy outcomes for readers. And one area that doesn't get discussed as often, and I'm hoping it does get discussed tonight, is the process of catharsis for author and illustrators in producing comics, graphic novels, and zines. For me, graphic mediums can be a vehicle for both exploring and nurturing identity, fostering culture, as well as transcending language and literary barriers. Borrowing from Marshall McLuhan's supposition that the medium is the message, illustrated and graphic literature expands our capacity to perceive the world around us. They are the perfect medium to explore our senses and challenge our notions of reality. It's therefore no surprise that they tell the story of diaspora, immigration, economic migration, and forced migration through conflict extremely well. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our moderator and master of ceremony for this evening to expand on some of these ideas and explore the world of comics and graphic novels and immigration. He reads, makes, teaches, preaches, performs, and delights in all things comic books. Please join me in welcoming Bernard Caleo.
Daniel Wee, thank you so much for that great introduction. So my name's Bernard, and I'm our moderator tonight for this talk, Comics and Immigration. I would like to welcome you all to this conversation, and I'd like to particularly thank the State Library for opening up this forum for this discussion, which I think is going to be really strong, a great impact, I suppose, for comics particularly. I'm very invested in the art of comics in Australia, and the more we've been, the panelists have been talking about this and sharing images, the more exciting it becomes, both for comics, but also, I think, for imagining and for grappling with questions of immigration. So, our panelists, let me introduce them to you. So, Safdar Ahmed, who is joining us from Hornsby in New South Wales, is a Sydney-based artist, musician, and academic, whose first graphic novel, Still Alive, is now available through 12 Panels Press. Dr. Daniela Trimboli, who's joining us from Adelaide, is a cultural studies academic at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization, and she is an expert on migrant identity. And Sean Tan, like myself, speaking to you from Naarm, from Melbourne, is an artist, writer, and filmmaker who is best known for illustrated books that deal with social and historical subjects through dream-like imagery. He is also, of the panel, the only Oscar winner. So we will speak with each of, I'm going to speak with each of these thinkers, makers, dreamers about their work, and we will come to grips with some of these questions of comics and immigration. But I'd just like to frame the conversation first. So we can go to our PowerPoint, our presentation. And I have selected an image from the State Library's picture collection, and it's by Tommy McRae, one of my favourite Australian cartoonists. Tommy McRae was an Aboriginal man, lived up on the Upper Murray, died in 1901, but in his lifetime did a lot of what I would call cartooning, drawing with pen and ink, the classic tools of the cartoonist, and detailing both traditional life and new ways of coming to grips with life in Australia. So I'd like to dedicate this talk tonight to Tommy McRae and this picture, one of his, the fishing picture of fishing that is held in the State Library collection. Okay, so while Tommy McRae was up on country drawing these pictures, over in the US of A, Richard Ukolt, who was first of all employed by Joseph Pulitzer on the New York World, was developing the language and the ideas that were going to become known as comics, sequential art, not just single images, but images in a sequence. And here we see a very early 1898 comic strip. By this stage, he's moved on to William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. But what those two great news moguls in New York they were using visual storytelling, illustration certainly, and comics to tell the stories of the city to a immigrant city, you know, the great huddled and poor and seeking a new world, coming through Ellis Island, arriving on the streets of New York, picking up these newspapers. English is not their first language, and so those newspaper magnates used comics, or comics developed, comics blossomed around the turn of the century. And Ukolt here is one of our the first, or at least very much a pioneer of comics. This is a character called the Yellow Kid. He's called the Yellow Kid not in racial terms, it's because of his night shirt that he's wearing. He's actually an Irish boy called Mickey Dugan, and his nightshirt is an early speech balloon. So on this it says, "Hey, you should see the other guy. I didn't do anything to him," which of course the paint on his hands and spattered on the shirt belies that story. Of course, he's gone in and he's beaten up the painter's son, which is what this comic is about. These comic strips by Ukolt and other early pioneers were incredibly violent and painted a really rumbustious Scorsesean picture of the streets of New York. So there were stories for immigrants in this pictorial form. There were stories of immigrants, and the next image I want to show you shows that comics, when they transformed into comic books in the 30s, became a sort of a song or a hymn to the immigrant. Because with Superman, first created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster in 1938, we see here a picture of the doomed planet Krypton exploding, and that little baby Caleo inside that, packed in there by his caring parents. Go away, go to a better place, they say to him. And Superman as the first superhero, Superman as the super immigrant, I think, is what that was the story they were telling, because Superman arrives on Earth, and here, not his home planet, he becomes the great helper. You know, every week, every episode, every issue, Superman saves all of us, just, you know, yokel Earth people, from threats, both terrestrial and interstellar. So I think I'm very excited to think about comics in this way, because it really shows them to be a form about immigrants, by immigrants, for immigrants. You know, I don't know whether I'm just seeing the world through a comics and immigration lens at the moment, but it seems to have helped to explain the magic of comics. So let's talk to Sean Tan. Sean, hello. How are you?
Good. It's a nice day in Melbourne.
It's a lovely day in Melbourne. And we've got some images from you, but before we do that, I'd just like to get a nutshell picture of your, like, my immigration story is that my dad's people 4 generations back came across here from the Aeolian Islands in Italy, and my mother's people came across in the 1850s to Melbourne. They were Irish people, and they set up a pub. What's your nutshell story?
My nutshell story is my mother is a 3rd generation Anglo-Irish Scottish person. And she was born in Western Australia, in Perth or Fremantle, and I was also born in Fremantle. But my father is Malaysian Chinese. He came to Western Australia in 1960 as a student, an architecture student. He was originally meant to go to Ballarat, but changed his mind at the last minute. And
why didn't he go to Ballarat?
Oh, I don't know. I think a bunch of his friends said, no, we're studying architecture in Perth. It's pretty cool here. And so he thought, oh, yeah, I'll hang with my pals. And he met my mother in a store that sold technical pens on a day when she was called from the back stock room to work at the front desk, the only day. And he was desperate for a date for an architectural student ball. Fast forward my existence. So anyway, that's their background. So I myself am not a migrant, unless you count moving from Perth to Melbourne. But I'm very interested in themes of migration and migrant experience, I think, not just for its own sake, but as a metaphor for life in general, because I feel that the experiences of migration amplify the experience of challenging lives that we all have to leave. You know, everything from the most prosaic, ordinary, banal details of making a meal to finding love and work and things like that. You know, having children, having a family. In the context of moving between countries, it becomes, you know, migration becomes a lens that just sort of expands these problems. They become so acute. So, and as an artist, I'm always looking for, you know, acute things, sort of extreme experiences.
It's like a magnifying.
Yeah, magnifying glass.
Yeah. So, looking at a picture here of the lost thing itself, where does the lost thing come from, Sean?
Well, that's the question that's never answered in the story, and I guess in creating this story, and I wanted to open with this slide, you know, as an explanation that I'm kind of interested in the idea of a migrant in the sense of a stranger in a strange land. That's something that's always interested me. I think we're all kind of, even if you don't move to another place, you're kind of a migrant the moment you're born. You know, you're a strange creature in a strange place, you know, which has come about through the accidents of history and circumstance. And I think we then begin to grapple with these accidents, try and figure out, you know, what the heck's going on. And in the case of the lost thing, it doesn't come from anywhere and it doesn't belong anywhere. So I was very interested in a story about a character that actually has no origin, and it has no destiny. And then what does society do with that, especially a society that's resistant to the idea of something that doesn't belong? And so I wrote that story. But in the beginning, it was really just a story about what would happen if I found a really weird, confronting lost creature on a beach and I felt sorry for it, but it was a bit inconvenient to take home. What would I do? You know, I guess, as with many deformed pets that our family adopted over the years, we would probably take it in and try and figure out what to do. And so that was just a kind of a thought experiment that turned into a picture book.
It's like a question of how are we going to get on together? How are we going to survive together, live together, make some sense?
Yeah, and communicate. Because I'm very interested in characters that can't speak, and that's a thing that I don't know whether it draws me to the visual medium or that I end up creating these characters because I work in a visual medium that's primarily silent. Like, I like pictures without words, and you know, I'm interested in characters that can't speak. And, you know, going back to origins, maybe it has something to do with the fact that I grew up in a family where one parent, in the primary language was his second language, and he didn't speak it very well. So I was kind of used to, you know, even as a child, having to sort of modify language a little bit when speaking with my dad. I don't know, I'm just really interested in the idea of how do you relate to things that are very different, and what does that reveal about yourself? You know, does it make you sort of want to close ranks around your identity, or at what point do you decide to be open? That's kind of the question that always interests me.
Yeah. Maybe we'll go to the next picture and talk about this little guy who turns up, this exchange student from
his name is Eric, but that's not his real name. His real name is unpronounceable. So it's a name of convenience, which is actually not unlike my father, whose name is Bing, which is an anglicized version of Beng, because nobody could get that right. So he changed it to Bing. So he could say as in Bing Crosby, and people wouldn't know who he was.
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Like that there's you find something that people have got some bearing on. You know, what's the nearest piece of floating wreckage on this ocean that people actually can latch onto.
Yeah, it's Bing Crosby.
Singing "Don't Fence Me In," maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, Eric's a little story that I wrote about a foreign exchange student that comes to live with an Australian family, and it's a very gentle story, but it's about cultural misunderstanding, which the great thing about visual literature is you can do so much playful things with unspoken details, like the fact that he's this tiny little guy with hardly any face, who is fragile like a little black leaf, and he goes and he sleeps in the pantry, and the family still lays out this table setting for him, and everything's giant, and he can't use it. And I kind of love that none of that is mentioned in the story. We only see it in the pictures, so there's always and I think this is true in all comics. It's what makes them fascinating. There's two streams. There's what you read and understand, and there's what you see, and there's often a little bit of a discrepancy. And that discrepancy really taps into the migrant experience of like seeing one thing, hearing another, trying to reconcile the two things and make sense of the world. So yeah, that's just another example, the story of Eric, but it really came about from a sketch of just a little leaf holding a suitcase and trying to figure out, well, what is that about?
What you say there about those two streams of comics also makes me think of course, the structural engine of comics really being that gutter, that gap in between one panel and the next. That's all the way through comic strips or comic novels, and it's that crack, I suppose, where you're invited or implored or required really to join those two boxes together. If they're diving into the ocean in panel 1 and in panel 2 they're riding dolphins, you need to bring your own thinking, your own images really, and join. It's like a big game of join the dots.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. I often think about it as joining the dots and taking out a lot of dots as a creator. So, I don't know about others, but I start off with very elaborate stories where the details all spelt out, and then there's a real pruning process of, okay, what can I take away to allow the reader space to imagine things for themselves? And I think, it's the same with good writing, good poetry, good songs. It's stripped back, so you're just sort of giving enough to inspire but not tell. And basically all books are nothing. They're nothing. It's just ink on paper. You're really like trying to draw things out of the memory of the reader. Just what have you got in there that I can get you to use? Like a magician, you're just doing silly tricks, but it's creating these illusions that become real in the mind of the reader. And the gutter in comics is such a great example of that. All the good stuff happens in the gaps. Yes. The space between the dots.
Yeah. You're as a reader of comics, you're this sort of this massively trusted assistant or something, in terms of the magic act of the story of and together you and the magician, the person who's throwing scarves around or sawing people in half, you're going to make this world really together. So now this next picture, Sean, is this someone you met in Perth?
Is this the yes? Yeah. So that's a story about two children who come across a faceless deep sea diver, and are very unsure what to do about it. It's actually a ghost story, really, that references the history of Japanese pearl divers in Broome, and many of them died from the bends, which was poorly understood in the late 19th and early 20th century. And just the idea of suburban kids in Western Australia coming across a dead Japanese pearl diver who's wandered across the desert, south, looking for solace. But I guess I had that in there as just a general example of the sort of image triggers for me, that I don't go looking for themes or meanings. I just think about things, or I might see an image by accident, a juxtaposition often that normally I would correct in terms of perception. I'd correct the perception, but I sort of go, well, what would imagine if that was a real thing, if there was a diver in a public park that looked like that, what would I do, and where could that go? And basically it's an interest in the strange juxtaposition, which then naturally leads to these themes of, where do we find these strange juxtapositions in real life? And it's when people move into territories that are not their own, and they have to navigate them with very limited resources.
Which indeed, is sort of a picture of those the divers up there in Broome. That those murky waters, making their way, navigating through this new sort of space, in order to make this money.
And just being really far from home, and the diving helmet is such a great image, and also the facelessness, that your identity is somewhat muted or voided by this shell, and you often go through life, I guess, in difficult situations by moving your shell, and there's something inside that's important, but it's very hidden. And I think that's the other thing that draws me to these stories and migrant stories, is an awareness that there's a lot of this stuff, especially with refugees, and they're talked about in the media and everything. But what you're not seeing is these hidden worlds, vast universes locked inside each person.
Yes.
And it's very hard to articulate them due to language and circumstance and perception that already exists. And I think as an artist, I'm interested in, how can we get into those invisible worlds?
Yeah. Yes. You're saying there also makes me think of the diving suit itself being like a crustacean itself. Like crustacean, those animals have, inside this hard shell, there's all this organic life going on. Very, very, very similar.
Yeah, and a pearl maybe.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about your comic. Sure. Here's a page from The Arrival from 2006. The Arrival, a wordless comic, or at least sequential paneled graphic novel thing, telling the story of a man coming to a new, strange world. What is this, a Roberts reference, this
yes.
picture? Yes.
Yep. Tom Roberts painting Going South, I think, is the original title.
Yes. Yeah, right.
Or Coming South, actually. It's more accurate since he's an Australian painter, talking about British people coming on a steamship, coming south. Yes, that there's a few in that book. There's a few references which are meant to be, recognizable to historical photographs and paintings of migrants around the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And it's the maybe the only comic I've done, I guess, that actually looks really like a comic. I'm an accidental graphic novelist, and basically it proves the logic of comics is that if you're trying to tell a visual story, sooner or later you're going to make a comic, because it's the most logical way to tell a detailed, nuanced story in pictures. And it's somewhere between a picture book and a film.
Yeah.
So, and films are comics too. They're just comics with 24 really fast frames every second, but they're all comics. And I think for me, at that time of creating that book, and I'm sure this is true of Safdar as well, you're looking for what's a practical way that I can actually make a story as a person with very limited resources, just pencil and paper. How can I tell a really visual story in a cinematic way? And The Arrival was my solution, because originally it was a short picture book, but as I researched the subject, I felt it didn't do justice to the kind of refugee stories that I was researching. I felt it was just too slight. I needed to go into the detail of the experience of arriving in a new country. And in order to do that, I needed more and more pictures, and I needed to fit more pictures on a page due to the constraints of publishing and how much my publisher would bear.
Yeah.
And so I ended up realizing, well, I'm going to have to make panels. I guess it's a comic. And at that point, I started researching comics, to figure out how to do a comic. It was like the book itself was like a PhD in comic creation that fortunately resulted in an actual publishable comic.
It taught you, the book itself taught you how to make it.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to just go through a few of these pages a little bit.
Yeah, just to show how it works.
Yeah.
For those unfamiliar with the book.
Yes.
A wordless comic too. Originally it had some text and I got rid of that, mainly to slow the reader down. That was my principal reason, just to slow it down.
And so taking words out slowed it down because that pushes people to read the pictures?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I found that the moment you put words to a picture, it's like putting a caption to a photograph. It's like a magnet for the attention. Yeah. And then it introduces the pace. So that words have a set tempo and it pulls you along. It's like a river, it pulls you along. And I wanted people to just stop. And that's also why the panels are very regular. It's not a very dynamic composition. Everything's very static. It's just so that you have the time to examine the pictures. You can read them fast or slow, it doesn't matter, but you do it at your own pace.
Yeah, and here we have the main character sort of writing, but then also making this origami bird. But then his attention is taken by this flotilla, this flock of, are they paper? That's one of those questions that you ask yourself while you're reading this book. And then we're faced with this enormous panorama, I suppose, which always makes me think, Sean, of Ellis Island and the introduction, getting, it's got a real New York resonance to it, this feel, this page. Yeah.
Just the thought of seeing a Statue of Liberty for the first time, remembering that in that period people would not necessarily have seen even an image of that, and how sort of discombobulating that would be to sort of all sorts of feelings, from very uplifting feelings to fear and trepidation, and but it's the great thing about drawings is that they're so open. Yes. It takes a lot of pressure off the creator to tell a story. You just have to show some stuff, and you don't have to invest it with meaning. You just sort of, it's the most fundamental experience. It's like pointing, mutely pointing. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that.
And here more than this. And I suppose I just wanted to progress quickly to this, because things have been fairly. There's been certainly in the book up to this point, sort of things that this person is escaping, but here we get this real probing and prodding, which I might talk to Safdar a bit more about, that sort of process of processing, I suppose, is being depicted here. And in this one, we recognise and realise that it's in fact Sean Pan who's the model for the main character in this comic book.
Yeah, back when I had more hair. That's I think a lot of comics creators end up drawing themselves. I've noticed that it's partly a question of convenience. I was actually looking for a model, like some actor, to play the character. I always imagined it was a bit of an older guy than I was at the time. But then I realized, you know, I can just use myself and save somebody else a great deal of agony having me direct them. So I basically made films. I made films in my house with myself, my family, friends, and a few actors I'd met in children's theatre. And I basically made these little films to see how things would look as a silent film. And then I selected the frames that best represented the actions that I wanted. And that's basically how I composed the book.
Wow. Okay. Comics and films connection again. And this is the last image that you'd selected, Sean. It's a very funny picture from the Bulletin, the Australian magazine of which had as a byline "Australia for the white man" until 1964. This is from 1909. It's by Livingston Hopkins. And can you just give your little speech about or thoughts about this picture before?
Well, it came because we had a preliminary discussion before this panel, and I was very interested in what you were saying about the history of comics and immigration, and which I hadn't really thought about that much, but the way in which comics are sort of quite an accessible form for migrant population, partly because you know, it uses visual literacy quite effectively, which is something everyone can read. But this cartoon came to mind, and I kind of really like it. It's so horrible. It's such a horrible racist cartoon, but it's almost like reality got revenge on this cartoonist, because I don't know if everyone can read the caption on the cartoon, but it says piebald possibilities, a little Australian Christmas family party of the future. And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, you know, that's exactly how it is. I don't know about other people, but when I go to some party in Melbourne, this kind of racial
mix,
you know, variety is what I see, and it's great. It's wonderful, you know. And then you look at all the things that they're pointing out as like, this is terrible, and I'm just going, great. So it's like it's just interesting insight into how immigration was perceived, because it was an anti-immigration cartoon. It's saying, like, if we go this way, I mean, look at the horrors that await us.
And this is actually it. This is
So
great.
Comics can enlighten and also make you stupid.
Thanks, Sean. Do stick around and please butt in if you have any ideas as we go. I'm going to talk to Daniela now. Daniela, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Now, Daniela, you're an academic. What is an academic?
I am.
The high halls of academia doing with the muddy, grotty medium of comics?
You know, taking risks, I think, being risky and not always favoured, I would say. But because I'm in the muddy halls of comics because they're so rich, you know, and they have so much to teach us, as I think Sean has already clearly illustrated, I think, through some of the wonderful things that he's discussed.
Oh, sorry, Daniel, what's the Trimboli immigration story, just before we get into the talking about what we're seeing?
So the Trimboli immigration story is my father is a Calabrese migrant. Well, actually, my father was the first of a few siblings to actually be born in Australia. So he has some siblings that were born in Calabria, Plati, and some that were born here. My mother is actually Scottish. She was born in Aberdeen in Scotland, and I think she came here when she was about 5 or 6 and kind of went back and forth a few times. So, yeah, I was born here. But yes, I'm very much driven, I guess, because of the way that I was brought up and the way that Italianness or being Calabrese infiltrated my everyday life so much that as I got older, I began to reflect a little bit more on what that meant, I guess, within the Australian context. So,
Yes, and that's your work. That's your.
And that's my work. Yes, that's my work. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I guess maybe it might be useful. I'm not sure, Bernard, but if I just sort of talk a little bit about that work before we go into the
That would be great. Thank you.
images, just so that I think I can talk better to the images once I give that context. So my work in cultural studies specialises in migrant identity, ethnic and race studies, and critical multiculturalism and diaspora studies. And I've been looking always really at different forms of contemporary visual art, but more recently at comics and zines. And one of the reasons is because I'm just finding them such a powerful way to represent the migrant experience, particularly in Anglo-settler colonies like Australia. And I've been looking at a few different varieties, I guess you could say, or different sites of zine and comic production. I've looked a lot at refugee zines, including the work that Safdar has been behind at Refugee Art Project, but also historical zines and comics, so things that have almost preempted what we would understand to be the contemporary zine. I've been looking at that a little bit more. And finally, and I'll probably focus on this with the images that I've selected, is I've been looking at comics and zines that are more contemporary, perhaps made within, say, the last decade by diasporic artists or artists who are probably at least third generation, well, second generation sometimes, but often third or beyond generation migrant within the Australian context. And I'm finding it a really interesting way to rethink certain aspects of migration. So I guess across all that work, what I'm interested in a nutshell, is sort of three kind of things that I think this work does that's really important. The first is simply that these zines and comics have a way of bringing stories that aren't normally circulated within dominant rhetoric or dominant narratives around Australia into circulation. And
comics are good at that, right? They're like little smuggling, things like that.
They are. And I was just thinking about that discussion you've had already with Sean about accessibility, not just in terms of visual literacy, but in terms of the culture of sharing that often comes with comics, and especially zine making and DIY comic making, and the way that's sort of implicit in the medium often is this sort of sharing. I'll swap you my zine for your zine. And so there's a certain, it allows stories to infiltrate in new ways and to bypass the kind of more formal channels, I guess, of literary production, which is really powerful and important.
Yeah. I've been reading a bit about mushrooms recently, and you're reminding me of like little rhizomes, like it's like comics are a bit more like, I guess, just spreading their little hyphae underneath the ground, as opposed to shrubs or trees, that sort of thing. A little bit more infiltrating. Yeah.
I love that. Yes, a bit more infiltrating. That is exactly it.
Yeah.
And I guess, and just in a sort of, a very obvious way, is that they do really start to allow things that have been rendered invisible for such a long time, that to start to give them visibility, which is really, of course, important. And then finally, and this is the thing that I've been very taken with in the last few years, is thinking about how comics and zines allow for a sort of disruption of what is a common way of thinking about migration, which is that migration sort of has very strict temporal bounds, or that once the moving of migration occurs, it becomes a static experience, when in fact that's really not the case for migrants. They say over and over again that the feeling of migration is kind of an ongoing feeling, and even for younger generations, or for people who they themselves haven't migrated, but their parents perhaps have, they kind of embody migration, and the sort of migration becomes part of their disposition in a way. So I'm finding that comics and zines are really amazing at portraying that.
That's very much chimes with, I think, what Sean was talking about it is sort of keeping on tumbling. The sort of one finds oneself in this world, and you sort of, and nothing is finished, nothing's done. You know, the ongoing work of, I don't know, making yourself at home. Is that what it is? Yes. Anyway, look, I thought we should talk about these pictures, because otherwise we'll run out of time. So please talk about this from Joshua Santos Spirito.
Yes. Okay, so yes, his first image I have taken from Joshua Santos Spirito's first edition of Swallow. So he's working on a second part at the moment. But what I love about it, I just selected this image. It traces his own exploration into his family's migration story. And I think on the next page, actually, he starts to introduce, one of his ancestors, Antonino. And on the next page that I haven't selected here, but it says, I can't even begin to imagine what his life was like. But then he goes on to imagine via this beautiful comic storytelling.
And literally to image it, to imagine
it. Yeah, and so it gives you this kind of, this option, this kind of, it's almost like a choose your own adventure, sort of is the way I read that comic, because it provides this story, but it's still quite open and lovely the way that does it. And on that page, you can sort of see as well the way that the comic format allows different movement between time and space. So you've actually got different tenses happening on the one page, which is a really powerful thing, I think.
Yes, and the way that the Josh character on the left-hand side is looking into the asylum, and then on the right-hand side, the Antonio is looking out. There's a real tie there, like a little babushka doll sort of.
There is, yes. Yeah, it's a lovely sort of interconnectivity between the generations, which I love.
I'm just going to go to the next.
Yeah, go to the next one. And then again, this one, I think this is really powerful image, just the way that kind of, the movement of time, and also the power that kind of gets carried over through generations of migrants as well, and that so much gets lost, but also so much gets absorbed as well. And I think that this story is really beautiful, that sort of beginning to acknowledge those things, or starting to figure out what they are. Like for Josh, he's sort of starting to figure out, well, what are these things that I have in my life that have come from experiences.
How are they nestled in me, or how do I?
Yeah, that's right. There's sort of a real kind of unlayering, which is quite lovely.
Okay, so let's move on to another very different looking double page spread from Lee Lai.
Lee Lai, yep. And this is just one of the reasons I love this comic is because I've been finding in my research that there is often this sense of disconnect between generations of migrants, not because it's a willing disconnect, but I think there's just different generations have different ways of communicating, and they've grown up in different ways as well. But, this comic by Leela, I think, for example, is reflecting on the ancestors and things that they could learn from their ancestor. And I just think comics by these sort of younger diasporic artists are really beautiful at bridging this disconnect, or at least trying to connect experiences in contemporary life to how can it relate to, my grandparents or my auntie or uncle or something like that, and try to understand those differences in a beautiful way.
Yeah, and also just in this comic too, that sort of the power of that older person just elbowing out of the way to get into the good melons. That's It's not. It's you know it's physical. It's embodied, and this older person has this sort of you know.
And it's just a real tip of the hat to the sort of survival.
Totally.
Survival of migrants, I think. You know. Yeah.
And that fruit market setting, so good, so good. Yeah.
So good. Yeah.
So let's talk about Rachel Ang.
Yes, Rachel Ang. Oh goodness, I could say so much about this artist. She's absolutely brilliant. But this is some work from her comic Swimsuit that was published by Glom Press. And you know, I've just chosen a couple of scenes here. It's her work is so beautiful because of the way that it really illustrates some of the tensions that are still so present, especially for racialized migrants in Australia. And so, you know, we talk a lot about successful Australian multiculturalism, but again, these zines and comics have a beautiful way of unpacking that and saying, well, you know, when we really look at the texture of everyday life, there's actually it's not all successful and roses. Yes. And this kind of way that Rachel, I think Sean said something about, you know, inspire the reader but not tell. And Rachel is just so incredible at doing that. She really, I mean, there's quite a lot of text on here compared to the next slide, but this is an encounter sort of that they're at the local swimming pool and they sort of encounter this sort of violence, you know, between a group of boys.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
and then
disturbing.
It really is, and you sort of each time you read it, I pick up new things, you know, every time I read it, and I think that's a lot of it is because of the fact that there is so much room for the reader because there's a lot of panels where there's no text, and there's a lot of room for you to reflect on what that violent encounter is, and then how it is related to the main character, which is, I think, on the next slide. Yeah, the sort of after this sort of violent encounter happens, they kind of go home, and you know, the way that comics is so powerful. I think just the language that they speak through the body is really important, and the way it affects this person. And yeah, I think Rachel just does some really excellent work around this sort of everyday encounters of race and racism, which is, really important.
And what I think a double page spread like this does is it shows that how that encounter, you know, continues to unfurl in someone's day and in their emotional state, and you know,
that's right.
Swirl, you know, she's sort of still in the water down there at the bottom of page 64.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right.
Wonderful. Okay, and who? Please introduce me to Dangerland. I don't know.
Dangerland. So, and I should say that some of these works, that the Dangerlands and Leela's as well, came from this incredible anthology of comics called Comic Sans, which focuses on comics by people of colour in Australia. And this is just a gorgeous little. I wanted to finish with this image because I think, again, this goes back to something that Sean's introduced, which is, when we're looking at comics and zines by migrants, or, you know, me as a migrant studies researcher, of course, going in there to think about migration, but of course, migrants aren't just migrants. They are so many other things. And I think even Comic Sans talks about itself as being, you know, how can drawing be a mode of inquiry? And I think about, that sort of allows... There's something in the comic medium that allows for a mode of inquiry, not just in terms of migration, but it sort of opens up the way that people just interact more generally. Mm-hmm. And something that I would love to be thought of a little bit more, you know, in terms of migrant studies and research is we often talk about cultural resilience and community resilience and things like that, especially within this current climate. But when you look at works by diasporic artists, you really start to think, well, there's so much, they have so many assets. They can teach us so much actually about resilience and adapting and how could we use that as a mode of politics, in everyday life? I think it's really exciting. And I loved that one by Dangerland, just because it's so open, and it is inquiring into the self, that the actual comic that it's taken from is a real questioning of, how am I perceived by other people, and how is my own perception of myself implicated by that? And I think it's just a lovely reminder as well about the fact that, we often look at migrant stories as being migrant stories, but they're also stories about being a person in the world more generally.
Thank you, Daniela. I'm going to talk to Safdar now, but thank you so much for that deep dive into those zines. That's great. And so, Safdar, sorry, my friend, I've left you 5 minutes here at the end of our talk, but Safdar's book, Still Alive, it was published this year, and I have to admit or say that I am one of the publishers. I'm one of part of 12 Panels Press. But Safdar, how did this book come about?
Okay, so Still Alive is basically based on my experience over the last decade or so of visiting the Villawood Detention Centre and conducting art workshops with people of a refugee background there. And so that community work, I think, was really important as the genesis of this book, because essentially in Refugee Art Project, beginning in Villawood, but also in Western Sydney, a really nice creative community has formed. There's been a lot of really interesting collaborations and hopefully opportunities as well for people, artists of a refugee background, to sort of have exhibitions and enter the art world and do all of that. So there's been a lot of, it's been an amazing community to be a part of. And so after about 4 years of visiting, then the idea came up to do Still Alive, to do a work of graphic journalism after the style of someone like Joe Sacco, which is all definitely, based on people's actual experiences and sort of my collaboration with them as well. Yes. Talking about the way refugees are treated by the Australian government in our detention system and the abuses which go on there, but also trying to show, as previous speakers have so aptly put it, that people should not be telescoped and only viewed through one lens, and that the category of refugee can also itself be quite dehumanizing and limiting, even when it's being talked about in a positive way. No one wants to be seen only through one such category. And so I hope the book also, whilst showing all of the truths that apply in terms of Australian government policy and people's experience of coming to Australia, I hope that it also thinks critically about representation, the way refugees are demonized and sometimes idealized as well. Issues of human rights, the fact that Australia has obligations to people based purely on the fact that, every person, whether they enjoy the protections of citizenship or not, every person has basic liberties and rights, and that you don't have to be a good or bad refugee to earn those rights. They come naturally. So all of those questions, I hope it kind of deals critically with some of those questions.
And Safdar, because we're talking about comics and immigration here, the form of comics seems to just allow this, putting another panel down and another panel down, this sort of continual process, I suppose, of discovery. That seems to be, I think of what the Refugee Art Project did in terms of giving people the space to make images of their own, and those images also show up in your book as well.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, that was also a strong intention of the book, was to not, hopefully not make it all in one voice, yes, or one perspective or one story or one view. So to that end, the book whilst there is one arc, there is one main character who I sort of meet in the beginning and whose story is traced through the book. For the most part, it's made up of anecdotes and fragmentary narratives and observations from a various range of different people of different age groups and backgrounds. And also including the artwork from the workshops in the book was another way of hopefully including the agency and the mark making, and the power of those drawings.
Yes.
Putting that in the graphic novel was another way I felt of diluting that monological approach, and making it more multivocal. So that felt important as well, apart from the fact that I just love the work that's come from the Refugee Art Project community because it's so strong and affecting and honest as well. So it was good to put that context in the book as well.
Yes. So again, Safdar, I do apologize about leaving that tiny little bit of time at the end there. Sorry, bad management on my part. But I would like to thank you very much for coming and speaking to us, and to you, Daniela, and to you, Sean Tan, for speaking about comics and immigration. Feels to me like this is an ongoing and long research project, both creatively and academically, and ways of discovering the not just the way to go politically, but also a great driver of cultural work. So I'd like to thank you all for your speaking and your drawing and your thinking. I'd like to thank everybody for coming along, and to thank the State Library of Victoria as well for hosting this talk. So thank you very much, and a good night.
Thanks, Bernard.
Beauty.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
See ya.